Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening whenever and wherever you are. And welcome back to the Beta Plan, reading for you the intro of Vampire the Masquerade Redemption. And why am I doing this? Well, I was actually opening the manual to get a little bit more of a feel for the game, when I learned that the entire first chapter of this manual is the background story of Sir Christof, the knight. And let's face it, seeing we do not have any, intros or cutscenes due to the way the game records, I thought it was quite nice to perhaps listen to me as I recite the history of Sir Christof. A sliver of moon broke through the grey clouds as Christof reached the top of the hill. The night wind cut through his battered armor, chilling his overheated body. His limbs ached as they never had before and cried out for rest. But he had not prayed all day and would not let his body collapse until he had done so. The Crusaders of the Order of the Sword Brethren had been on a forced march since dawn, chasing the faster, lighter, armored barbarians. Sir Cuthbert had reluctantly allowed them to stop only when nightfall made further travel impossible. After pitching their tents, the Crusaders gratefully collapsed onto their straw mats. But Christof did not. He had a need greater than sleep. Friar Bertrand's energetic orations against the barbarians were stirring, but his perfunctory prayers gave little consolation to the 18-year-old crusader. The Saviour had decreed that Christians pray alone in their private chambers, and Christof had diligently followed that stricture every day since childhood. But there were no private chambers in the wasteland of Moravia, so the desolate wind-swept hilltop would have to suffice. Christof paused at the peak of the hill and looked down. From his perch he could see the entire Crusader camp etched in cold moonlight. A dozen watchfires glowed reassuringly around the perimeter, warding off the terrors of the night. Most of the Crusaders slumbered, bone-weary from the day's forced march. Even some of the watch dozed fitfully at their posts. All was quiet, except for a few unarmored serfs who scurried around about the camp, hauling sacks of grain, digging a shallow cesspit, and preparing for the morning meal. For the first time that day, Christof felt safe. He pulled off his heavy, battered helmet and let it clatter to the ground. The cold night air lashed his long brown hair, which matted and was dripping wet. He rubbed his eyes with a mailed fist, wiping away rust and sweat mingled with the grit of the road. His armor was battered and in need of repair. The white cloth over his mail hauberk was torn in many places and streaked with dull, brown, dried blood. But the crimson cross across the chest was still as bright and proud as the day he first wore it. His limbs ached from weeks of marching. But Christof was not ready to rest. He drew his broadsword from its scabbard, plunged the tip into the crust of the dry earth, and knelt before it. He pressed his feverish brow into the handle, closed his eyes, and prayed quietly. Our Father who art in heaven. But his mind did not stay on the prayer. The tension that had coiled around his warrior's spine slowly melted away, and as the tension ebbed, a flood of memories rose up unbidden and unwelcome. In his 16 years, Christof had never struck a blow in anger. In the little French village of St. Clair, he had raced against, wrestled, and mock-dueled every lad and able-bodied man. He won most of his bouts and always emerged unscathed, as if protected from on high, until the day a wild boar had thundered across the village green. The boar charged the villagers, who scattered before it like geese, jabbering in terror as the boar snorted and slashed. Two watchmen panicked and fled, dropping their hatchets as they ran past slower-moving villagers. Christof easily outran the massive pig, but a scream more piercing than all the others cut through him like a razor. He turned and saw the boar had trampled the small child who lay crying on the green. A white-hot fury ignited in Christof's chest. He stopped and held his ground as the slower villagers ran past him. In a moment, the village green was empty except for the child, the boar, and Christof. The massive pig wheeled to survey the damage it had done. It snorted with satisfaction and lowered its yellowed tusks to charge the screaming child once again. Then it noticed Christof, now very alone on the green. It charged in Christof's direction, testing the lone, impudent creature who did not fly from his wrath. Christof quickly stepped sideways toward Odd, narrowly evading the creature. The boar sped past him and hurtled back around the green. Satisfied that Christof will no longer defied him, the boar returned his attention to the squalling child. Christof grabbed a sharpened tent pole from the hut and approached his child. The boar snorted with rage, stomped the grass and charged Christof, determined to punish this act of defiance. Christof crouched low, planted the butt end of the spike in the ground and braced against it. He faced the beast and lowered towards it in unrushing jaws. The spike snapped like dry kindling on the boar, toppled Christof and gored his right shoulder. The beast snarled a blast of hot, foul breath in frustration as it realized that it had charged open-mouthed right into the tent spike. It stomped its hoof and ripped at Christof's chest, tusks inches from Christof's face. But the spike had torn through the boar's gaping mouth and shattered its neck bone. Its monstrous head glowered with impotent, disbelieving rage as the light slowly faded from its eyes. The village poured into the green, cheering. They hauled the monster off the gasping and bleeding Christof. The village elders held a week-long festival in Christof's honor, and for those 7 days he was great as King David. Christof, God hath given thee a great gift of courage, the elders said. Thou art meant for greater glory than life as a freeman baker or cobbler. Perhaps thou shalt become the youngest village elder. The vain glory felt sweet, but also embraced him. The lasses adored him and lavished him with honey-eyed praise. Christof, thou art the bravest man in Christendom. Blessed is she thou takest to wife. The lads also admired him. Christof, thou shalt fight him for the glory of God. Go far from St. Clair, join the crusade and bring fame to our village. But Christof barely heard any of them. All he could see was the massive, oppressive face of the beast, inches from his face. Angry, hateful, fire in its dead eyes. Christof shook his head to dispel the memory and focused once again upon his prayer. He was anxious to finish and eager to sleep. He continued quietly, Forgive our trespasses, and as we forgive those who trespass against us. In his 17 years, Christof had never killed a man. The hot sun beat down on him, and a roaring filled his ears, drowning out the angry clash of steel on steel. Sparks flew before his eyes, and his head spun around as the barbarian axe struck his helmet from the right. Christof was certain he was dead. He prayed that the Lord would find his soul in the midst of the battlefield wasteland, and blindly gave his sword one final thrust. The pommel rattled painfully in his hand as his blade bit deeply into the flesh and struck hard bone. The barbarian collapsed like a straw man at the harvest festival and lay still. The ringing in Christof's ears subsided, and his vision slowly cleared. He tugged at his sword, which had pierced the barbarian's heart. The weapon did not budge. It was caught on the barbarian's ribs and would not dislodge. Christof gripped the hilt with both hands and yanked furiously. The barbarian's corpse folded upwards as if rising from the dead. The scattered chest bones groaned like the hinges of hell and snapped open as the sword burst free. The broken body crashed back to the earth, shuddered, and lay still. But one hand stuck straight up, as though begging Christof for absolution. Christof stared down into the dead man's hollow eyes. The piercing black pupils stared back with the same accusing, disbelieving look as the boar. Christof looked away, but knew the sight would never leave him for all his days. Again Christof tried to shake off the memory and focus on his prayer, but he felt ill at ease, and the prayer brought him no comfort. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from. His attention drifted from the prayer, but not to another memory. He opened his eyes and peered down the hill to the troops slumbering below. The camp was quiet, except for a few serfs finishing their chores. Though they carried heavy packs that weighed as much as Crusaders' arms and armor, they were expected to labor while the troops slept. All seemed well. Christof was closing his eyes again when he realized that a guard outside St. Cuthbert's tent was swaying drunkenly at his post. Christof opened his eyes and watched as a small serf in a hood and tunic whispered into the ear of the tall guard. The guard fell backward, nearly toppling into Sir Cuthbert's tent, but the short serf effortlessly pulled the large man away from the tent and quietly lowered his body to the ground. Then the serf darted toward the guard at the opening of Sir Cuthbert's tent. Christof pulled his sword from the ground and he leapt to his feet. He tried to cry out, but no sound emerged from his mouth. He charged down the hill as the small serf gently lowered the second guard to the ground. Wary Crusaders glowered at Christof as he stormed past them. Only when the serf disappeared into St. Cuthbert's tent did Christof finally find his voice. "Alarum! Alarum!" he shouted breathlessly and bursting into the tent. The serf was already crouching over St. Cuthbert, who lay atop his straw pallet, dead to the world. Christof's sword flashed into the torchlight and crashed down on the serf's head, where it bit deeply with satisfying crunch. The skull caved in and a chunk of bone and gristle flew across the tent. But the serf did not fall. Instead he turned and glowered at Christof with eyes that were black pools of hate. Christof froze. For a moment all was still in the tent as the serf locked eyes on him. Dead eyes. Full of hate. Then the serf snarled and clawed at Christof with long crackled fingernails encrusted with filth. Christof dimly noticed his sword bouncing silently off the hard earth at his feet, and his right arm suddenly felt cold and far away. The serf paused to wipe his eyes clean of the blood that flowed freely from the gaping head wound Christof had delivered. The serf crinkled his ashen face into a wicked leer. His thin, dry lips peeled back to reveal long, glistering yellow teeth. The yellowed fangs flashed in the torchlight as he silently lunged towards Christof's unarmored head. The stillness abruptly shattered with a roar as shouting men and clanking mail burst into the tent. The serf unlocked his grasp of Christof's arms and pushed him towards the charging Crusaders. Christof stumbled in backward, blocking their path. The serf howled a hideous, high-pitched snarl and turned and shredding the back of the tent with a sweep of his razor-sharp talons. He bounded through the hall and ran, toppling a Crusader stood in his path. Christof found he could suddenly move again and charged after the serf. He ran headlong through the dark past gropey troops, rising from the deep and troubled sleep. An uproar swept through the camp. Finally Christof slowed. He peered into the darkness, but to no avail. The creature had vanished into the chill of the night. Fear replaced exhaustion in the hearts of the salt brethren, and banished all hope of sleep as word of the blood-mad devil raced from man to man. Two of St. Cuthbert's officers found the shivering Christof and led him back to St. Cuthbert's tattered tent, which flapped in the night wind despite the efforts of several serfs to mend it. The tent was now ringed with a barrier of St. Cuthbert's retainers, who muttered angrily to one another, debating the most fitting punishments for the serf once they caught him. Sir Cuthbert's steward parted them and beckoned for Christof to enter. The retainers stepped inside to admit Cuthbert's officers, but they scowled suspiciously at Christof, who appeared indistinguishably from any other frontline soldier. Inside the tent, the white-haired company empiric was examining a pale Sir Cuthbert, who looked weary but solid as granite. At length the old man gruffed announced, "'Tis the will of God that St. Cuthbert be delivered from the devil's grasp. He is whole." The officers roared with relief and toasted his health, but an impatient Sir Cuthbert pushed past them and strode out of the tent. Outside, the anxious troop erupted in cheers with an abrupt wave of his hand. Sir Cuthbert cut them off, and the camp fell silent. Sir Cuthbert surveyed his man for a long moment before speaking. "Saved!" he hoarsely bellowed. "By the grace of God!" The troops cheered again, louder. Christof tried to follow Sir Cuthbert out of the tent, but the empiric blocked his path. The old man peeled back the blood-soaked mail from Christof's right forearm and gripped his biceps to stanch the blood flow. He forced Christof to sit on a barrel. "The demon unleashed a torrent of blood from thy arm," the old man scolded, pouring wine over the jagged claw marks. "Thy very life leaks out upon the uncaring soil." He gently rinsed grit from the wound and wrapped it tightly in fresh linen. "Disturb not this dressing," he said sternly. When he finished, the empiric retrieved Christof's broadsword from the ground. The old man scowled as he handed Christof the weapon, saying, "When next thou art inclined to chase the spawn of hell, pray remember thy bring thy sword." And just for a moment, Christof thought he saw a hint of smile on the sour face of the old man, who had witnessed so much suffering and death. Outside the tent, Friar Bertrand intoned, "In the name of our Lord and God Jesus Christ, for his glory and for the exaltation of his holy faith, Amen. The barbarian dogs felt the sting of God's wrath in our swords, and they fear us. They flee our wrath like cowards. They cannot win by honest force of arms, so they have sent a devil to our camp to slay your lord and master, Sir Cuthbert. But the Lord was with us this day and drove the devil from the sight of righteous men." The crusaders cheered again, louder. As Friar Bertrand continued his litany, Sir Cuthbert stepped back into his tent. He approached his steward and said, "Give the man an extra tot of brandy tonight, or they will never rest." "But is it that wise?" the steward asked. "We might rise before dawn. If we should delay further, that barbarian horde shall surely—" "We have lost those jackals," Sir Cuthbert snapped. "We could wander these hills for weeks and not find their trail. The filthy barbarian wear armor of fur so they may run like deer and hide like mice. But it will protect them no more than it did the beast that they skinned." He paused and composed himself. "No, let the man sleep past sunrise. We've pushed him hard enough for 1 week." "Whither do we go after sunrise?" the steward asked. "To the barbarian supply camp. We shall seek for it here in these Moravian hills. It was doubtless the horde's destination, and we are close. By God, or their demon master would never have risked entering our camp, even by night." "Yes, my lord," the steward replied, "but they will continue to seek thy murder." "Aye, my retinue will protect me if God wills it. Now fetch the man the brandy. Tomorrow we scout these hills. I want the man full of vigor when we find the barbarian camp." "It shall be so," the steward nodded, turning to leave. Sir Cuthbert glanced at Christof. "Who is this boy?" he snapped to the steward. "The very one who smote the demon and drove him from this tent." Cuthbert studied Christof a moment, and then motioned for him to approach. Christof stepped forward, trying to conceal the trembling in his knees. He had never been this close to the great crusader before. Christof fumbled as he clumsily sheathed his sword and knelt. "What is thy name, boy?" asked Sir Cuthbert. "Christof Romuald, of St. Clair." "Thou art a brave lad and true, Christof Romuald of St. Clair. Dost thou love God?" "Aye, my liege." "Seek ye salvation of thy sinner's soul?" "With all my heart, my liege." "Art thou prepared to die for the kingdom of God?" "Aye, my liege." "No longer shalt thou fight upon the line. Thou shalt join my retinue and smite all who would kill me." Christof felt lightheaded, almost giddy. "I obey, my liege," he said breathlessly. "Thou hast cleft the devil's skull in twain and lived to boast of it." Christof nodded slowly. "God has smiled upon thee. He spared thee from certain death because he was conceived a higher purpose for thee. Therefore fear not in battle, but give the devil his due, for thou art blessed." "Aye," Christof replied, though he was far from reassured. Christof slept deeply that night, dragged under the weariness and wine. For the first time, the hateful hollow eyes of the dead boar and the dead barbarian no longer haunted him. Instead, all he could see were the hateful, living eyes of a dead man. I thank you for listening, and hopefully you enjoyed this little audiobook experience. And remember, great peril yields great beauty.